Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Dakota, a YouTube channel that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. The title of today's video is, This is what happens when a narcissist returns home for a family visit, the unrelenting loop of despair. Now, despair comes in many different forms, but the focus of today's video is going to be on a family conflict, followed by deep feelings of shame and humiliation and an overall feeling devalued. In this video, we're going to look at authentic personal experiences that are pulled from my online research, social media online research, and from my private practice. And they're going to talk about the hurdles that these individuals face when they return to the family, what I like to call the scene of the crime. This approach is going to allow us to take a look at overarching themes, and then we want to look at the cause, like what causes this unrelenting loop of despair. And as you know, if you've heard other videos of mine, it's always really important to have a theory, because the theory guides the technique. In other words, how do we help somebody like this? Either if this is personally us who is going through these experiences with our own family, how do we get out of this loop of despair? Or how do we help someone who's close to us? And finally, that's what we'll do, is we'll look at some approaches that we could use when talking to these individuals. Picture the following scenario. An individual returns home, right? This is a self-proclaimed narcissist who knows, he says it, that he has trouble with drinking and drugs, and he feels like he's working well below his means and capacities. So he returns home to the family, and throughout the day, he's, I don't want to say complaining, but he's talking about his current life situation. And here you could fill in the gap, okay? This way it could relate to you more personally. So he may be complaining about how he's working below his means, how he doesn't have any intimate or close relationships with friends, he's not dating, right? He's not happy at his job. So these are just various things. So he has problems personally, he has problems at work, and he's talking about this through the day and getting various, suggestions, maybe even a little bit of advice. Towards the end of the day, his mother says to him, I'm going to help you out with this. I'm going to send you some, again, you could fill in the blank here, some job advertisements, right? Maybe some social clubs in your neighborhood so that you could get more involved, so you don't feel so isolated. Heck, his mother will probably even set him up with a girlfriend if he would allow her to do that. So he immediately becomes really upset, and he starts yelling that, you think I'm a pathetic failure. You see me as such a loser. And he does what he calls is he begins to unload on her. So as he's doing this, he's aware that his mother probably isn't really judging him and doesn't really think that he's pathetic, but he feels this way nevertheless. And he says to me, what I'm doing is I'm projecting my self-hatred. So like many individuals who are in this situation, luckily there's so much descriptive information out there online that we have these words like projecting. But unfortunately, we don't always have a good understanding of what it means. And this is what he begins to say, is he tells me that he knows this. And even when a little bit later a family member tries to calm him down and says something like, your mother's just trying to be helpful and compassionate. And he could say, look, I know that she's trying to help, but nevertheless, I know the way she sees me as well. And she sees me as such a pathetic loser. And this then begins to spiral, and he can't get himself out of it, despite his intellect and cognitive, abilities to say, I'm projecting, and I know this is not true. The following day he goes home and he's still in this cycle. He thinks that his friends are all talking about him, that his friends don't like him. His colleagues at work think that he's completely incompetent. He can't even leave his apartment, he tells me, because his next door neighbor's going to judge him for this or that. Or if somebody who lives in a home, you could picture how hard it is just for them to step outside the door because the next door neighbor's judging them because they don't have the right car, or their front yard doesn't look as nice as their neighbor's. Anyway, you get the picture. This really begins to spiral. So now that I've described, and this is all descriptive by the way, the anguish that this fellow is really experiencing and how he can't get himself out of it, let's look at this from a different perspective to see how we can be helpful and begin to understand this. So you know my bias, if you've listened to my videos before, that I'm coming from what's known as a psychoanalytic perspective. Now, psychoanalytically, we begin, this isn't even psychoanalytic yet. We could just say, what's the most pressing thing here? What's at the most manifest level is that this fellow feels so humiliated and judged by everybody in his life. Let's start with a few basic assumptions that we know about narcissism. What's the most important thing to the narcissist? The most important thing is the grandiose, omnipotent sense of self. But what does it mean for them to sustain this image of themselves? They need what? Constant attention, admiration, affirmation, just to know that somebody is always there for them. Knowing that, let's go back over the story because you probably noticed this yourself. But what was it that preceded him getting upset and becoming deregulated? It was when his mother offered to send him something, right? His mother's attempt to be helpful, right? Now you may be saying, okay, what's the big deal? I mean, what's the problem with his mother who's trying to be helpful? Now, again, we have to borrow a little bit from psychoanalytic theory. And if we go back, if we sort of take this from, if we take a step back, we know developmentally, one thing that's really important is in this early relation, the child's early relationship with the caregiver, that they feel a sense of what? Attunement, holding, affirmation, right? That if they cry, you know, the caregiver is there, that there's sort of an unconscious connectedness. If you look at this, it's really quite beautiful. A mother who is really in tune with the baby. If the baby cries, the mother responds and knows exactly what that cry is and what the child needs. So what happens when this attunement does not occur? And again, you may have heard me say this in other videos, but the child may experience frustration. Now, some frustration is inevitable. One, you know, we have this phrase, the good enough mother. The mother doesn't have to be perfect. But what happens when frustrations are prolonged, it leads to feelings of hostility, right? In other words, if there's more frustration than there is attunement, the baby begins to feel, the developing child begins to feel frustrated. There's this old saying, there's no such thing as an absent caregiver, only a bad caregiver. So they feel frustrated that the caregiver is doing something to them. And this frustration can lead to hostility and anger. But again, if things go accordingly, the developing child begins to feel a bond and a sense that he or she is understood. Now, let's go back to the scenario with this individual. He does not feel understood. If we're talking about frustrations, he feels that his mother is frustrating him. She's not supportive, empathic, or sympathetic. Instead, she's frustrating and judging him in his mind. And by the way, if we go over the comment by the mother, you may have heard this already, but there actually is a grain of truth to his concerns, because what is the implicit message? Remember, this is a grown adult. The implicit message is, I will send you job advertisements, I'll send you a local social club. In other words, let me take care of this for you because I know you're not capable of taking care of this yourself. That I know you can't function like an adult. I don't trust that you can function like an adult, so you better let me do it. So it's important to understand that with these little frustrations, if there's been a long history of this, that this is the kind of stuff that leads to hostility. And then hostility leads to the feeling that somebody is doing something intentionally to me. And this gets played out in many different iterations when people go home. Again, the scene of the crime. I say that because they're already in somewhat of a regressed state of mind because they're returning home to a situation that most likely was quite traumatic. That's how they grew up to be who they are today. And this can play out in any number of different ways. Like this, another simple example. A young woman was telling me she went home and her mother made, her favorite meal, which was like clams on the half shell, right? And the clams weren't cooked enough. And the patient went into a rage. She couldn't believe that her mother didn't understand, didn't remember the way she liked her clams cooked. Okay, I think you get the picture. So let's press forward. Why do these people have this particular reaction, right? Why do they begin to feel judged? Why does he feel like his mother sees him as so pathetic? Again, if things go accordingly, developmentally, there's a sense of goodness in oneself, and they begin to trust that they're good, but also that the caregiver is good. This is what we call emotional attunement. And when there's emotional attunement is high, there's more love, more loving feelings than destructive feeling. Now, these individuals happen to experience extremes, right? And I don't want to oversimplify this too much, but let's say that growing up, they were either overly stimulated, which means what? In the early environment, there may have been a lot of chaos, anger, hostility, drinking, drugs, right? So it's overstimulating, or even a parental figure who takes care of too many things for you, right? That everything always has to be perfect. And then on the other end of the spectrum are those individuals who are understimulated. And let me not even split it up that way, because at moments in these family environments, if they're quite chaotic, at one moment there could be overstimulation, and the next moment understimulated, which is what? That's the kind of caregiver who may not really be available, who seems to be absent, again leaves the child frustrated or waiting too long, is depressed, withdrawn, maybe preoccupied narcissistically with his or her own needs. So we see both ends of the spectrum. So let's return to this fellow now. He did say one thing, by the way, when he was spiraling that I forgot to mention earlier. In his spiral of how his mother and then his other family members see him as so pathetic, he said, I always felt this way. Since a young age, I knew that everybody was judging me. And then we begin to raise questions, and that's how we work with these individuals. And in my mind, I may begin to wonder, like, he always felt this way. Who could he bring these feelings to? If he always felt judged, did he bring them to his parents? Did he bring them to his mother? And if so, if not, why? And if he did, how did she respond? So exploration of this revealed, and if you can picture this scenario, this hypothetical, he goes home and he hurts, he has some injury, he hurts his knee, and he turns to his mother to let her know about his knee pain. And she says something like, you think you have pain? When your baby sister was born, she cracked my pelvis. We didn't even have anesthesia back then. You want to talk to me about pain? That's pain. But in other words, you see, I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but actually not really, because that's an authentic story as well. But this is a mother who takes over his experience, and you can imagine he wouldn't leave feeling very validated after a scenario, a situation like that. And this is, I think, what gets triggered when his mother offers to take over the situation. Send them the jobs, set them up with a date, send them a local social club, whatever it may be. So overall, what begins to happen in early in life, and this is what gets perpetuated today. Now we're right in the heart of breaking this cycle, because we really need to understand what's happening here. That's why I wanted to give a little bit of this background. What begins to happen is he has, or this type of individual has, more frustration and hostility and feelings of persecution, right, as compared to loving, comforting, harmonious situations in the family. So now when this happens, and you could hear it, if he used the word projection. So with the projection, it looks like this. I feel ashamed of myself and what I made out of my life. But you may have noticed that gets turned into, you are ashamed of me. Now, I want to emphasize this, and I can't say enough about it, that even though he has the intellectual capacity to say, I'm projecting a sense of my poor self-worth, that's like a throwaway comment. If someone says that to you, it's a throwaway comment. It doesn't mean anything. You have to get a lot closer to that experience and understand what it means for him. If there's more love than hate, right? The goal now with this patient to break this cycle is to enable them to take in love, because that's the antidote to this hateful, destructive inner environment. But it doesn't work that easily. A student of mine said the other day in a class that I'm teaching, but if we're just there and we're always very empathic and understanding, isn't that enough for the patient? And you could see from this example I gave, first of all, always being there and being empathic and understanding and validating them, supporting them, it's not enough, because his mother made an attempt to do that. A good friend, by the way, can do something like that. And we know many of these patients have friends who do this, or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, but it doesn't work. So we need to do something more. The proposed recommendations, or what I find to be the most helpful, it's like, one is we acknowledge and we help them acknowledge their own destructive impulses. See, if you notice, none of this destruction is coming from him. It's coming from the environment. People are always attacking him. He's never angry. So he doesn't own his own feelings. And you know the way this works. When you don't own your own feeling because it's too painful, you need to get rid of it. And then you see it coming from without instead of from within. So 2 is he has to take ownership of these feelings, and we have to help him do that. We have to, once he can then begin to take ownership, and I went into this in great detail on a video I did on paranoia. There were 3 parts. I did it in part 3. So if you want to know, like, step by step how to help somebody begin to take ownership of the projections, go back and check out that video. But the ultimate goal is to set this patient up, this kind of person up, where they begin to have a capacity to develop a more loving inner world instead of such a hostile and destructive inner world that's made up of mainly what? Judgments and criticism. Okay, we have to begin to wrap it up here. But I want to say you have half the puzzle already, right, in terms of breaking this vicious cycle. Half of the piece of the puzzle is we need to help them with the projections, and we need to enable them to begin to take in and have a more harmonious inner world, which I mentioned before, is something that they don't have growing up as children. So how do we do that? We did not talk about projection. You see, in my research of the literature, social media content review, I saw so much about projection and very little bit about introjection. So we need to talk about introjection and what critical role that plays in breaking this cycle. But unfortunately, we have to hold off there for today. But please stay tuned. And by the way, this stuff, I know it can get quite complicated. If I said anything that was confusing, please feel free to reach out, shoot me an email. Otherwise, stay tuned for part 2 of this 2-part series, where I'll go into far more detail about introjection, right? We covered projection, but now we have to talk about introjection in order to really be able to break this vicious cycle. Okay, until next time.